Good morning, it's Deb Watson, and today I'm going to give you some tips on how to paint figures in watercolor. With watercolor, you start with white paper. Painting on white paper makes it really hard to judge your values. So one way you can get around that is by working in layers. On the first layer, I worked on the entire picture, bringing it all into soft focus. Here's layers 1 and 2. You can see in layer 1 we did the first value. In layer 2 we added some of the shadows and shadows within shadows. And in layer 3 we're running for home, doing all the finishing touches and adjustments that make a nice watercolor. Let's get started. For this painting, I'm using quinacridone red, cobalt blue, Hansa light, and a little bit of my own black mix. For the first layer, I'm using watery light layers of color. I'm starting with the shirt, and I'm leaving the lightest part of the shirt unpainted at this point. But you can see that I'm using a lot of water and very little paint. Now, when you paint fabric, you have to pay attention to where the folds are, where the shadows and the highlights are. I know it's very tempting to start by painting that number 4, but odds are good that it'll smear as we keep going over it. So save that for last. Now, I added some of my black mix to my blue to make this darker value. It's still very watery. And I want to show you one way that you can get soft edges. If you take your brush and squeeze all the liquid out, it becomes a thirsty brush. Then you can pick up paint instead of putting it down. And by lifting paint, I get lighter areas and nice soft edges. So using a thirsty brush is one way you can get those soft edges. For his pants, I mixed red and blue to make a little bit of purple and added a touch of yellow to make a gray. But feel free to use any gray you like, as long as it's very watery and light. His pants are actually white, but most of them are in the shadow. You can see I'm also doing his sock. For the skin color, I mixed an orange, a reddish orange, not a yellow orange, with my red and yellow, and then added just a touch of the blue or gray color to make a brown. His shoes are the same color as the hat, and I'm putting the shadow in underneath him with that same color. I think tennis shoes are fun to paint. And the baseball glove is going to be the same color as the skin. That's a brown, which is a reddish orange plus blue, just using a little more paint. Before I start with the background, I'd like to show you how you can practice doing a wet in wet wash to see if you can get some grass to grow. Working wet on wet is tricky, so if you have some scrap paper, give yourself at least 4 areas to practice. You want to wet the paper with your sky color or even clean water and use a smaller brush to put in a little bit of green right below it. And then see, how does it spread? Does it spread up? And you can experiment with having your sky be wetter or drying, and having your grass be wetter or drier. So I'm going to try it 4 times, and you can see it's varying results. But the only way you can really get a handle on doing this is by practice. So if you want to grow grass the way I do in this video, take some scrap paper and give it a go and see exactly what happens. Because watercolor often has what they call happy accidents, where it does something unexpected that looks really nice that you didn't really plan. And working wet on wet is going to give you a higher chance of having a happy accident on your painting. Also, because you want people to be looking at the figure and not the grass, if you can put wet on wet grass in with your figure, it's going to be a really nice effect. And it doesn't have to look exactly like grass at all, just a suggestion of grass. So here goes. I'm wetting the background with my 3/4 inch wash brush, and I'm not getting terribly close to the figure, but I'm wetting everything around except for that base that he's standing on. And then I just put my grass color in there and let it go. Now, I wasn't sure what kind of color I wanted on the background. I started with a little bit of the grayed purple, just like I did for his pants. And I'm using a smaller brush to get that wash closer to the figure. And there I'm putting a little more purple and blue in as I bring it up really close to the figure. You're going to need a hint of color beside the highlight areas, the white areas on his pants and the lighter areas on his shirt, because otherwise you won't be able to see the edges. So as long as it's wet on wet, I can keep working on it. It's spreading a little far. I try some down at the bottom, and just looking at it, I decide I don't like it and dab it back up. What I'm doing is creating a subtle diagonal that goes from the top left in a diagonal down beside his elbow. Now we're ready for the second layer. This is all dry, and I'm using the same colors, only more paint and less water. If you have trouble seeing the detail in the shoes or the catcher's mitt, if you have an iPad or an iPhone, I would pull up the original photo there, because you'll be able to expand it and you can get great detail on those screens. You can see exactly what you want to paint. Whereas with your printed picture, it can be a lot more difficult. So there's his shoe, and I'm getting a little more color on his hat, and I'm going to show you another way you can get soft edges. I'm working on dry paper, just getting the dark color on there on the dry paper, and then I'm going to wet my brush with clean water and paint the area I want lighter with clean water, and just rub the edges to let that blend a little bit. I'm doing the same colors for the skin, a reddish orange, and this time I'm using a little bit of my black mix. His neck is very dark in the shading, and I'm using that same method. I painted the lighter area and the dark area on dry paper, and then just blended them a little bit with the brush. It's hard getting all your values right, but if you build it up layer by layer, it's easier to see what works and doesn't. Now for his shirt, I'm going over the area I left light for the second wash and gently rubbing those edges so that I soften them up a little bit. I'm getting some of the folds of the cloth are a little bit darker in the folds. And there's a little more blue color on his shirt. For his pants, I'm putting the shadows in the shadows. I'm putting in more gray where I see the folds. You don't have to do every single fold. Depends on how much realism you want. But just some suggestions of where they are. And I'm making his socks in the shadow too. Now his hair is kind of blondish, but in the shadow it's more of a brown. So it gets the same color as the skin, but I'm leaving it a little lighter at the edge so there's some definition. And the side of his ear is very dark too. The catcher's mitt, I'm not very good with catcher's mitts. I didn't play baseball, so I'll have to blow my picture up and see exactly where this detail goes. Now the second layer is dry, and I'm putting in the darkest layers. You can see there's shadows within the shadows. And that's where the realism comes in. Getting shadows with soft edges that look right is difficult. And one way to make it easier and doable is to work step by step. Work with a light layer, a medium layer, a dark layer, and if you need it, a black. There'll be a few places with just pure black in some of your pictures. And I'm suggesting a few hairs. Here's the really dark. And finally, I know you've been waiting for it, we're going to paint in his number. So another way, if you have hard edges that don't want to soften, you can use your white to soften edges between the light and the dark areas. And you can also use white to get rid of the pencil lines. Here I'm putting a hint of shadow under the space and just a touch of color on the top. And here he is. So I hope that helps with your figures. Work layer by layer and you're going to have quick, successful figures. Happy painting!